Hello there! I'm Zayas, and this is my second video in my series on Utah ghost towns. And this video, the first video in the series went up 7 months ago. And I am terribly sorry. I had a whole plan for making content, I had a bunch of videos scripted out, and that all fell out the window when I did. Thankfully, I have climbed back up into the proverbial window of life, and I have drugged my content plan back with me. So hopefully from here on out, I'll be making a video every other week. As a little bit of an introduction, I am Zayas. I'm an amateur historian and geologist, which means I'm a goober who likes history and I like rocks. If you were also a goober um, that likes those things, please subscribe, comment, like, all that good stuff. But with that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started with today's video, which is talking about the ghost town of Millfork. I love Millfork. It's personally like one of the ghost towns that first got me interested in the topic. Um, Especially regarding like ghost towns in Utah. And so I kind of want to divide the video into three parts. Um, the first, there's two parts. We'll be talking about the history of Millfork. But before that, I want to discuss a little bit about why Millfork is kind of an example of what a lot of ghost towns in Utah are going to look like during this series. A lot of ghost towns in Utah are stories about people trying to carve a life out of the inhospitable wilderness. Utah nowadays is very hospitable. There's trees everywhere, and the grass is green, and the sky is blue, and the mountains are gorgeous, right? It's very nice. But it hasn't always been this way. I mean, heck, in our last video, we talked about Mosita, where the crops failed and water was too expensive to pump, and that's a big part of the reason why that city failed. Nowadays, we rely on so many innovations regarding how to pump water, piping for water, how to transport things quickly, right? Supplies. Your city may not have any like industry to it necessarily, but it's able to sustain itself because there's companies and businesses that are operating digital websites or digital programs that bring in money and cash flow and commerce. But back in the early days of Utah, there wasn't any of that, right? And so people were trying to wrest what life they could from the desert that is Utah. And a lot of that was based around key industries. Whether or not it was the silver mines, or if you built your city close to an important road or junction, you had to build your city around something that could bring in industry, people, and commerce. Because otherwise, in the barren hills of Utah, it would fizzle out quickly. And so, with a lot of ghost towns in Utah, they were initially built around really strong starts. Whether or not it was Ajax or Mosita or Millfork, they were built around a couple key industries, maybe a key location, but then maybe, things shift and that location isn't as important anymore, or that industry slows down. And as that industry slows down, things kind of begin to collapse. And as things collapse, you have to move on. And you can't risk your family suffering out there in the hills of Utah for nothing, so you move on to the next place or the next location, and then it becomes a ghost town. Millfork falls into that cycle pretty well. Millfork was initially established in 1875. The sources differ. Some say 1877, 1875. I'm linking my sources down below, but we'll settle kind of on the 1875 number because that seems to be what most sources agree on. But in and around that time was when it was established. Millfork was an important railroad junction. Back in the day, railroad trains needed water stops, but also the hills around Millfork were rather steep, and so a helper engine would help push trains and other engines over the steep hills near Mosita. This made it an important stop to the railroad, but also there were 3 mills established by the Utah Pleasant Valley Railroad Company. Try saying that 5 times fast. You probably can better than me. But these three mills were established to help produce railroad ties for the growing railroad. So now we have a town that's in a key location with a bit of industry. And these mills that brought industry also brought in people. As people began to flock to the town of Millfork, both for the location and the industry, they began to build the town around them. First, a watermill, a reservoir, a general store, housing for the railroad employees. Um, Everything kind of began to be built in the next 13 years or so. The population grew to about 250 people, and these people worked hard. They were trying to eke out a life from this rough wilderness. But as they came to the town, they began to establish another incredibly important industry for the history of Millfork. The railroad ties and the mills had kind of built the foundation of Millfork, and as this foundation was built on these railroad ties and the railroad stop, the people built a beating heart for Millfork, which was the charcoal industry. The lumber in and around the Millfork area not only made great railroad ties, it also made awesome charcoal. And this business became incredibly important because the kilns made to produce charcoal needed people to work the kilns, but also required a lot of people in the logging industry to go chop down trees and bring in trees to feed the kilns and produce the charcoal. This second industry sort of helped Millfork reach its zenith, right? These first 13 years were awesome. I'm sure that to a lot of people in Millfork, the future looked bright. You have the railroad, you have the charcoal industry, you have all these things being built. But even with the second industry, the end of Millfork was coming swiftly. As after these first 13 years of growth and expansion, within 15 years, so just within 2 more years, the charcoal business was shut down. And this immediately had a massive impact on Millfork. Many of the people that worked for the charcoal business, both as loggers and working the kilns themselves, were now completely out of a job. With that sort of beating heart of Millfork stopped dead, a lot of these people had to leave. And as they left, other key infrastructure of Millfork began to crumble. The general store closed down, and Millfork was in serious decline. Millfork was still a water stop for local railroad companies, and the helper engine was still stationed there. So it kept a few jobs open for railroad employees and the few remaining homesteaders. But besides that, everyone had left. So within only 25 years of being founded, Millfork was nothing more than a few homesteaders and railroad employees. And this small community remained for a long time. For the next 40 years, Millfork held out. And then another death knell struck. And this time, it came with a very different name. It wasn't an industry that stopped, but rather an industry that had progressed beyond the need for Millfork. The railroad that had provided the foundation for the initial city of Millfork, and was still providing the few remaining jobs in the area, switched to diesel. And diesel engines no longer needed the water stop at Millfork, and they no longer needed the faithful helper engine to push them over the hills. And with that, the Millfork was obsolete. It was no longer needed. It no longer had industry. It was no longer a key location. So with that, Millfork held on a couple more years, but then the railroad station was shut down in 1947. Finally, the section house was removed in 1950. So in about 75 years, Millfork was no more. It only had remained a somewhat bigger town for 15 years, and those final few people held on for another 50, but in the end, all that is left of Millfork is its cemetery. The cemetery is somewhat maintained to this day. There's like a group of people in Utah that help maintain it. And you can go visit it. You can go see the residents, their graves, read some of their stories, as I've said. But kind of like I mentioned, Millfork was a key location. It was a water stop. It was you needed help to get over those hills. It had industry, and then as one industry died, the town began to suffer. And as the railroad companies no longer needed ties, it began to suffer even more. It was still a key location, and that kept some people, but then as things progressed, it was no longer a key location. And you will see this pattern time and again with Utah ghost towns. As they lose this relevancy, people are forced to move on because they needed some way to provide a life for their families. But besides that, the people of Millfork left behind their stories. Unfortunately, in the case of Millfork, what's been left behind is mostly tragedies. And I will warn you, this part of the video will be very sad. The stories of the people of Millfork that are left are, like I said, tragedies. Um, the tragedies of those that are buried in the cemetery and of just the city at large. I think these stories are still important because they are all that's left behind of the people of Millfork. An important reminder that in the end of your life, in 100 years, all that may be left of you could be a story. And your actions might determine whether or not that story is a sad one, a happy one, a funny one, who knows. I'm only going to share a couple of the stories from Millfork. There are more, and I suggest if you want to look more into them, go ahead and read them. The ones I'm going to share are sort of the ones that stuck out to me the most. The first is regarding the Finch family, and the second one will be about the Ballards. Now, at the time, in good old 1893, there was a lot of outbreaks of scarlet fever. And a lot of people in Millfork kind of hoped that the sort of isolation they felt in the town would protect them. Even though it was a railroad stop, Millfork is, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, right? There's no town over the next hill. There's not a ton of, infiltration from the outside world into the town. At least some people felt that way, and they thought that that might protect them from these outbreaks and the perils of the world at large. But they were unfortunately reminded that even though you may try to escape from the world, it can oftentimes still reach you. A woman and a child, unnamed in the stories I could find of them, were fleeing from the scarlet fever outbreaks elsewhere. They came to Millfork, and the woman didn't tell anyone that there had been outbreaks in her previous community. Some of the people in the community were suspicious of them, but the Finch family took them in and their children spent time together. And unfortunately, this woman had brought the fever with her. And details differ on how widespread the outbreak was, but for the Finch family, the results were the same either way. Three of the Finch children, overcome with the disease, were buried there in the Millfork Cemetery. Their names were Edna, Effie, and Georgia. And when I think about the story, like, part of my head kind of turns with the idea of what if that woman had said something, right? Or if she had been honest, right? But also, that woman was terrified, right? She was trying to escape the scarlet fever. And her escape brought it, or her attempt to escape it, brought it to the people of Millfork, who, in their own way, were hoping to be protected from it. And so it's hard to judge this woman too harshly because, if she had told them, maybe they wouldn't have let her in. They would have kicked her out, right? She might have been ostracized. And, there's sort of this balance of the terrible fear she must have felt, but also the terrible tragedy she caused in others by not facing her own fears, right? And so this story serves as a reminder that the world can reach you wherever you are, and just because you might think you're safe from some, worldwide impact, you might not be. But also, if people sometimes things happen to you that aren't your fault, right? The Finch family was just being kind, taking someone in. But that person's decisions led to this terrible sort of escalation. And this is just one of the sad stories at Millfork. The next story is about the Ballard family. And this family, or this story rather, is very tragic to me personally because it touches on a lot of things that I have studied and I have looked into. Um, but the Ballard family actually didn't live in Millfork. Although they are buried there now, Ida and Paris Ballard lived in Salt Lake. They had a bit of a rocky relationship. Paris would often go on long work trips, and he had a bit of a problem with alcohol. When he would drink, he would become madly jealous. He would accuse Ida of cheating, and his instability had begun to worry her. It escalated and escalated until eventually Ida brought home a sheriff one day. But when they arrived at the home, Paris was gone. He, unbeknownst to the sheriff or Ida, had gone out to buy a whiskey and a gun, which for an unstable, jealous man was never going to end well. But Ida remained home by herself, and Paris returned. In an argument gone out of control, Paris drug the terrified Ida into the home, shot her, and then himself. Ida died at the scene, and Paris a few hours later. Although it is unknown why, the pair were kept together in death and buried together at the cemetery in Millfork. And this story is horrific. There's so many parts of the story that seem to call out to you, you know. To me in particular, I feel like, why didn't the sheriff stay, right? Why was Paris, this deeply unstable alcoholic, sold a gun, right? Why, the neighbors who heard the yelling and the argument, who may have even seen Ida be drugged inside the home, why did they not say something? Why was the sheriff not called then, right? Why did Ida stay in this home just waiting for Paris to come home, right? There's so many parts of this story that make it feel like it could have been prevented, that, any one action or inaction might have changed it. And that's kind of the message I want to end today with. I don't want to necessarily be super philosophical or like try to be deep in these videos or anything. But it's an interesting thing to consider when you look at the history of a place like Millfork. The history of Millfork itself was relatively simple. The town kind of came and went, and a lot of the reasons the town succeeded or failed were out of the hands of the people in it, right? But a story like Paris and Ida, there's so many points where it feels like Ida or Paris or the sheriff or their neighbors could have made an impact, could have changed the course of this story. If Paris maybe, had gotten help, had changed his drinking problem, right? Things could have been different. If the neighbors had intervened, if the sheriff had stayed, if Ida had left, maybe things could have been changed. And now 150 years later, I'm retelling the story. The story is still being told and shared with the people that go to visit the Millfork Cemetery. And so it goes to show, what actions are you taking in your life? Are you going to make a story that is a tragedy 150 years later? Or are you going to make a story that's, told for a different reason? Maybe it's a great success or a great failure, who knows? But with that, thank you for joining me as I explored the history of Millfork and of some of the people that were there. Go ahead and make a good story for yourself today and for your life to come. Thanks for being here, and I will see you in 2 weeks, hopefully.